They say the Mongols feared nothing. Not winter, not rivers, not armies, 10 times their size. By 1240, their name alone was enough to empty cities. Entire kingdoms collapsed before Mongol scouts even arrived. Resistance was not just crushed, it was erased so completely that survivors carried the warning forward for them. The Mongols were not just winning wars, they were rewriting reality. And yet, in that same year, something happened that should not exist. On a cold northern river, far from the open plains where Mongol power was absolute, a small force stood its ground. Not a massive coalition, not a legendary army, but warriors descended from Vikings, fighters of forests, rivers, and ice, led by a young commander who should have been irrelevant. And after this clash, something unthinkable followed. The Mongol-aligned advance slowed. Routes changed. The north was avoided. History tells us the Mongols were unstoppable. So why did they hesitate here? Why did a single river battle in 1240 echo so loudly that it altered behaviour rather than borders? And why does this moment rarely appear in discussions of Mongol fear? By the end of this story, you'll understand how an empire built on terror encountered something it could not easily destroy. Not defeat, but unpredictability. Because fear does not always come from losing. Sometimes it comes from realizing the world no longer obeys your rules. Before we rewind, the questions must be asked. Why did Mongol pressure ease in the northern riverlands after this battle? Why did later campaigns avoid terrain like this? Why did this young commander survive when others vanished? And why did chroniclers grow strangely careful when describing what happened next? The answers are uncomfortable. So let's go back to a world already collapsing. In the early 13th century, Eurasia was breaking apart under pressure no one fully understood. The Mongols had emerged from the steppe with a form of warfare that seemed almost supernatural to their enemies. They moved faster than expected. They struck where no one was prepared. They punished resistance so brutally that surrender became a rational choice. Cities that closed their gates were annihilated. Cities that opened them sometimes lived. Fear was the weapon. By the late 1230s, the Russ's principalities had already learned this lesson the hard way. Many had resisted, many had burned. Survivors paid tribute or waited, knowing the next blow could fall at any time. The land was fractured, trust was gone, and unity was impossible. This weakness invited other predators. From the west, crusading forces saw opportunity. Swedish-led armies moved through the Baltic, eyeing the river systems that controlled trade and movement. If the east was broken by Mongol pressure, the north could be taken quickly. Their target was the Neva River. The Neva was not just water, it was power. Whoever controlled it controlled access between the Baltic and the interior. Supplies, troops, commerce, all flowed through this artery. And guarding it was a prince barely out of his 20s, Alexander. He did not yet carry the name history would remember. He had no legendary reputation, no massive army at his back. What he had was awareness. Alexander understood something most commanders ignored. Battles are not won by numbers alone. They are won by timing, terrain, and belief. The invading force moving up the Neva expected delay, negotiation, disorganization. They believed the region was already psychologically defeated by the Mongol threat. They believed wrong. Alexander did not wait behind walls. He did not summon allies who would arrive too late. He did not allow fear to spread. He moved first. The attack came suddenly, before camps were fully established, before defensive formations stabilized, before command structures could impose order. Riverbanks became traps. The confined terrain erased advantages. Ships limited movement. Forests blocked vision. The river itself controlled momentum. What followed was not a prolonged battle. It was impact. Steel on steel. Shouting in unfamiliar tongues. Chaos where certainty was expected. And here's what history doesn't tell you clearly. This battle mattered not because of its scale, but because of its message. The invaders expected submission. They encountered resistance. They expected control. They found disorder, and disorder was dangerous. because Mongol-aligned warfare relied on predictability, on dictating the rhythm of violence, on forcing enemies to react instead of act. At the Neva, that rhythm was broken. Survivors carried stories back with them, stories that travelled faster than facts. They spoke of warriors striking from nowhere, of terrain that swallowed formations, of leadership that refused hesitation, some embellished, some exaggerated. But fear does not need accuracy, it needs possibility. And the possibility that northern warriors could choose the battlefield and win was deeply unsettling, because if it happened once, it could happen again. Alexander did not pursue retreating forces. He did not chase glory. He did not escalate. He stopped. This restraint was deliberate, because escalation invites annihilation. And Alexander understood something vital. Survival was the victory. While cities burned elsewhere, the north remained intact. And as the year progressed, something subtle but important occurred. The Mongol-aligned world recalculated. Scouts reported difficult terrain. Commanders noted limited reward. Momentum shifted toward easier conquests. The Neva did not break the Mongols, but it disrupted certainty. And in empires built on inevitability, disruption is dangerous. Because inevitability is what makes fear efficient. Remove it, and fear becomes negotiation. Alexander would later face far greater threats. But this moment, the river, the surprise, the refusal to submit, was where the myth cracked. Not loudly, quietly, and that quiet hesitation would shape everything that followed. Because once fear pauses, history changes direction. The silence after the battle was more disturbing than the clash itself. No retaliation followed, no overwhelming counterstrike. No cities in the north were erased to make an example. For an empire that answered resistance with annihilation, this absence was impossible to ignore, because this is what usually happened. When a region resisted Mongol pressure, directly or indirectly, the response was swift and absolute. Scouts returned, numbers multiplied. The next encounter was not a battle, but a punishment. But after the Neva, nothing came. And that is where fear began to move in the opposite direction. Not fear among Alexander's men, fear within the system that believed it understood how the world worked. To understand why this pause mattered, we need to understand Mongol logic, not the myth, but the machinery. The Mongols did not conquer through recklessness. They conquered through calculation. Every campaign was measured against cost, terrain, speed, and psychological return. Open plains were ideal. Predictable enemies were ideal. Extended supply routes were acceptable only if fear guaranteed surrender ahead. Northern Rus offered none of that. Dense forests broke cavalry formations. Rivers limited maneuverability. Winter extended beyond what steppe logistics favoured. And now there was proof that these conditions could be exploited. The Battle of the Neva did not demonstrate strength. It demonstrated comprehension. Alexander had not simply resisted, he had understood. And for the Mongols, enemies who understood were more dangerous than enemies who fought bravely. Because bravery could be crushed. Understanding required adaptation, and adaptation slowed momentum. After 1240, Mongol-aligned forces adjusted their behaviour. They still dominated vast regions. They still demanded tribute. They still destroyed resistance where it made sense. But in the north, the pressure became indirect. Tribute, not annihilation. Influence, not invasion. Control through compliance, not obliteration. Alexander recognized this shift immediately, and instead of exploiting it recklessly, he leaned into it. He did something that looked like submission, but functioned like survival. He acknowledged Mongol authority when necessary. He paid tribute. He avoided provocation, and in return, he preserved autonomy where it mattered. This was not weakness. It was strategic restraint, because Alexander understood something few leaders grasped in time. You do not defeat an empire like the Mongols head-on. You outlast it. But here's what history doesn't tell you outright. Alexander's survival made him dangerous to everyone else. Western powers saw him as an obstacle. Rival princes saw him as a threat. And the Mongols saw him as useful. That last part is critical because fear does not always eliminate. Sometimes it incorporates. Alexander became a buffer, a stabilizer, a ruler who could keep the north quiet without forcing Mongol intervention. And the Battle of the Neva was the reason he was trusted to do so, because it proved he could control his territory, and control mattered more than conquest. But this balance was fragile, because fear never disappears. It waits. As years passed, stories of the Neva grew, not in official chronicles, but in whispers, among soldiers, traders, travellers, moving between worlds. They spoke of a river where confidence died, of warriors who attacked before fear could be deployed, of leadership that chose shock over endurance. Some stories grew darker, that the attackers appeared from the mist, that the river swallowed ships whole, that the land itself resisted outsiders. None of it was true, but belief shapes behaviour, and behaviour shapes strategy. This mattered deeply as Mongol campaigns continued elsewhere, because commanders remembered the Neva not as a defeat, but as a complication, and empires hate complications. Alexander did not attempt to build an empire of his own. He did not chase Mongol weakness. He did not inspire open rebellion. Instead, he fortified understanding. He restructured defences around terrain. He emphasized mobility and intelligence. He trained forces to fight where cavalry dominance dissolved. In doing so, he created something rare, a region that was not conquered, not liberated, but tolerated. And tolerance, in an age of annihilation, was extraordinary. But the story does not end here, because fear has a way of resurfacing when myths are challenged. And the myth of Mongol invincibility had now been scratched, not shattered, scratched, and scratches spread. The Neva was not the only moment Alexander would exploit terrain and timing, but it was the first that mattered on an imperial scale, because it introduced doubt, and doubt is contagious, especially when it spreads quietly. This is where the story tightens again, because the Mongols did not forget the north. They simply delayed it, and delays, in history, are often more revealing than attacks, because they show you what an empire truly fears. And in the years that followed, as Alexander navigated diplomacy, submission, and silent resistance, the shadow of the Neva never disappeared. It followed him, and it followed the Mongols too, because once fear moves both ways, power becomes negotiation, and negotiation is where myths go to die. The Battle of the Neva did not change the world overnight, but it altered expectations. And when expectations change, history becomes unstable, because now the question was no longer whether the Mongols could conquer everything. It was whether everything was worth conquering, and that question would haunt the empire longer than any battlefield loss, because the most terrifying thing for an spirit of unstoppable force is discovering a place where stopping makes sense. Time passed, empires expanded, borders shifted, cities burned and were rebuilt, but the memory of the Neva never fully faded. It lingered not as a song of triumph, but as an unresolved problem, and unresolved problems are dangerous, because they invite questions. As the Mongol sphere of influence solidified, its administrators and generals began to do what every long-lasting empire does. They analysed anomalies. They looked for places where expected outcomes failed to materialise. The northern riverlands were one of those places. On maps, they looked insignificant. Sparse populations, harsh climates, limited immediate wealth. But history had proven something else. These lands did not behave like conquered territory. They resisted without open rebellion. They complied without surrendering identity. They survived without being erased. And at the centre of this contradiction stood Alexander. By now he was no longer just a prince. He was a known quantity, not because of his armies, but because of his judgment. The Mongols valued order above all else. Chaos was the enemy. Regions that required constant intervention drained momentum. Leaders who could maintain stability without rebellion were assets. Alexander became such an asset. But here's what history doesn't tell you directly. Being useful to an empire like the Mongols was almost as dangerous as opposing it, because usefulness invites scrutiny. Alexander was summoned east, not as a prisoner, not as a rebel, but as a subordinate ruler expected to prove loyalty. This journey was not ceremonial, it was a test. He travelled deep into Mongol-controlled territory, where power was visible not in architecture, but in obedience, where entire peoples existed at the discretion of distant commanders, and Alexander watched. He saw how tribute was extracted, how loyalty was measured, how resistance was remembered, and he learned. This is the part of the story most people misunderstand. They imagine Alexander as a defiant hero standing against the Mongol tide. He was not. He was something far more effective. He was adaptive. Alexander understood that survival required compromise, but not submission of identity. He accepted Mongol authority where refusal meant destruction. But he resisted cultural erasure, religious annihilation, and internal collapse. He bent where bending preserved life, and he stood firm where standing preserved meaning. This balance made him dangerous to myth, because myths prefer simplicity, heroes who resist, villains who dominate. Alexander did neither cleanly, and that made his story harder to tell. But the Battle of the Neva explains everything because it established the terms. It proved that under the right conditions, Mongol certainty could be disrupted, not through strength, but through awareness, and awareness was spreading. Other leaders took note, not openly, not loudly, but quietly. They studied terrain more carefully. They avoided predictable defences. They delayed confrontation. Fear was no longer monopolized. But here's where the story tightens again. Because Mongol fear was not emotional. It was strategic. As campaigns pushed westward, commanders remembered the cost of uncertainty. They favoured open plains over forests, speed over entanglement, certainty over complication. And the north remained complicated. Alexander's lands were not worth the risk. Not yet. But myths do not die easily. The Mongol reputation remained intact in most of the world. Cities still surrendered at the sound of approaching hooves. Fear still preceded armies. Yet beneath that fear, a crack had formed. The idea that Mongol power was absolute was no longer uncontested, and cracks invite pressure. Alexander would face other enemies, most notably crusading forces from the west. These were not Mongols. They fought differently, thought differently, believed differently, and yet Alexander defeated them too, on ice, on rivers, in terrain that punished rigidity. Each victory reinforced the same lesson. Environment matters, timing matters, certainty can be broken. And the Mongols noticed, not because Alexander threatened them militarily, but because he threatened the narrative. Empires survive on belief as much as force. When belief erodes, control becomes expensive. The Neva had shown that fear could be neutralized, if only briefly, and even brief neutralization was unacceptable. Yet the Mongols never moved to eliminate Alexander. That fact alone should unsettle you, because the Mongols eliminated threats, unless those threats served a purpose. Alexander maintained order. He prevented rebellion. He ensured tribute flowed. But he did something else. Quietly. He preserved a frontier culture that was not fully absorbed. And that preservation mattered centuries later. Because while Mongol dominance eventually faded, cultures that adapted, instead of collapsing, endured. Alexander's world survived the Mongol era intact enough to rebuild. And that survival traced back to a single moment of refusal on a river in 1240. But we're not done yet, because the most dangerous effect of the Neva was not immediate. It was delayed. It lived in memory, in how future generations understood fear. The Mongols taught the world that resistance was futile. Alexander proved that resistance could be selective, and that idea would echo far beyond his lifetime, because once people believe fear can be managed, they stop being paralyzed by it. And that is the true enemy of terror-based empires. The Battle of the Neva did not announce itself as history-changing. It whispered, and whispers travel. As Alexander aged, his reputation solidified, not as a conqueror, but as a survivor of impossible pressure. He was canonized later, not for empire building, but for preservation. That tells you everything, because saints are not made from victory alone. They are made from endurance. And endurance is what terrified the Mongols most, because endurance cannot be crushed quickly. It waits, and what waits long enough outlives empires. But to fully understand why this battle mattered, we need to confront the myth directly, because the myth says the Mongols were never afraid, and myths rarely survive contact with nuance. That confrontation comes next, because once we separate legend from reality, the Neva becomes something else entirely. Not a fluke, not a footnote, but a warning. The myth tells us the Mongols never felt fear, that they rode from horizon to horizon with absolute certainty, crushing everything in their path, without hesitation, without doubt, without pause. But myths are built from distance, and distance hides hesitation. When you examine what actually happened after 1240, not just in battles, but in decisions, the picture changes, because the Mongols did not charge north. They did not erase the Neva region from the map. They did not hunt Alexander down, even though they easily could have. Instead, they recalculated. And recalculation is the first admission that certainty has limits. The Battle of the Neva did not defeat the Mongols militarily. It defeated an assumption, the assumption that fear could only move in one direction. What happened on that river forced Mongol commanders to acknowledge something they had avoided confronting elsewhere, that terrain, timing, and local intelligence could neutralize their greatest advantages. And once that realization exists, it cannot be erased. From that point forward, the North became categorized differently, not as conquered, not as rebellious, but as inefficient. And inefficiency was the one thing the Mongols truly avoided. This is why the story matters, because history often measures importance by territory gained or lost. But empires measure importance by cost, and the Neva raised the cost of conquest, not in blood, but in uncertainty. Alexander understood this. He never tried to turn the battle into a legend of domination. He never declared himself a Mongol slayer. He never inspired reckless rebellion. Instead, he allowed the myth to remain ambiguous. Ambiguity was protection, because as long as the Mongols were unsure about terrain, loyalty, resistance, they would hesitate, and hesitation preserved life. This is where myth and reality finally separate. The myth says the Mongols were unstoppable. The reality says they were selective. They chose battles they could control. They avoided environments that disrupted their systems. They prioritized momentum over vengeance. Alexander gave them a reason to avoid the north. And avoidance, when practiced by an empire built on fear, is itself a form of fear. Not emotional fear, strategic fear. The fear of unpredictability, the fear of diminishing returns, the fear that not every frontier could be mastered cheaply. And that fear reshaped behavior. Long after Alexander's death, the North retained a distinct identity. Its political structures survived. Its cultural and religious traditions endured. While other regions were transformed beyond recognition, this one adapted without dissolving. And that adaptation began with a single decision: to strike first, in the right place, at the right moment. The Neva was not about winning a war. It was about redefining the terms of survival. And this is the lesson history rarely teaches clearly. Power does not collapse when it loses a battle. It collapses when its model stops working. The Mongol model relied on inevitability, on fear preceding force, on resistance being irrational. The Neva proved resistance could be rational if it was precise. And that precision mattered far beyond 1240, because once one group survives by understanding fear instead of submitting to it, others begin to ask questions. Questions weaken myths, and weakened myths weaken empires. The Mongols eventually receded, not because of a single defeat, but because the world adapted, because enemies learned, because environments mattered. Alexander Nevsky's role in that adaptation is subtle but essential. He did not break the Mongols. He taught the world how to live with them, until living without them became possible. That is why this battle endures, not as a tale of overwhelming victory, but as a moment when fear changed direction. When an unstoppable force encountered a boundary, it chose not to cross. And that choice tells us more about power than any conquest ever could, because the most dangerous thing for an empire is not defeat. It is discovering that fear no longer guarantees obedience. And once that discovery is made, history begins to loosen its grip, quietly, irreversibly. On a cold river in 1240, fear blinked, and the world noticed. History remembers conquest. It remembers burning cities, shattered armies, and empires expanding across maps until there is nowhere left to colour red. What it rarely remembers are the moments when conquest hesitated. The Battle of the Neva was not a decisive defeat. It did not end Mongol power. It did not reverse the tide of history overnight. But it did something far more unsettling. It introduced doubt into a system built on inevitability. The Mongols conquered by convincing the world resistance was pointless. Alexander Nevsky proved resistance could be selective, calculated, and survivable. And that distinction matters, because fear is only effective when it feels absolute. The moment fear gains conditions, it weakens. The Neva showed that terrain could matter more than numbers, that timing could matter more than reputation, that understanding an empire could be more powerful than challenging it directly. Alexander did not become great by destroying the Mongols. He became great by outlasting them, by choosing when to fight, when to bend, and when to wait. Empires fall, not when they lose battles, but when their myths stop working. The myth of Mongol invincibility survived many defeats, but it never fully recovered from the idea that some frontiers were not worth the cost. That fear could be managed. That inevitability had exceptions. On a cold river in 1240, the world learned something dangerous, that even the most terrifying empire in history had limits, not imposed by force, but by understanding. And once people understand fear, they stop being ruled by it. That is why this battle still matters, because history is not shaped only by those who conquer, but by those who survive long enough to change what conquest means.